So speech number 2, the general purpose, the main goal of the speech, if you remember, is to inform. And so to that end, when we're considering our style when crafting our speeches, we should ask ourselves whether or not that style is good for an informative speech, is good for conveying information in a comprehensive and organized way. So in this lecture, I'm going to define what I mean by an informative style and give you lots of examples to consider. To me, an informative style is one that is concise, clear, concrete, and connected. Remember, style is all about language choices. We can use this word or that word. We can use this example or that example. When you're crafting your speeches, you should be considering the style really throughout the whole process, from when you begin the invention and researching stage, all the way through to rehearsal when you are adapting the speech for how your mouth likes to say it and how it feels in your body. So style is about language choices. In speech number 2, your language choices should be guided by an informative style. So what do I mean by an informative style? Well, an informative style is one that uses concise, plain, and direct language. We want to use, not too many words. We want to be pretty straightforward and direct in our expression of ideas. An informative style is vivid and concrete language. It has memorable and specific language that sticks in the audience's mind and is easy to visualize. An informative style is going to avoid abstractions, and when it does get into some abstractions, it's going to clarify those abstractions. It's going to help us understand things that are vague or difficult or complex to have in our minds. An informative style, similarly, is going to avoid jargon or technical terms. And when it does use terms that are not well known, it's going to clearly define those terms. An informative style will offer examples of things. It will compare one thing with another to give us a frame of reference. An informative style will use planned repetition and redundancy to drive home important ideas and to help the audience find their way through the speech. And then lastly, an informative style is going to be personal. It's going to relate ideas to both the speaker and the speaker's life and to the audience so that they're easy to understand and, again, more memorable. Let's dig deeper into each of these. Let's start with the first, concise, plain, and direct language. We don't want to use more words than we have to. We have a limited amount of time, and our audiences have a limited amount of processing space. And we also want to be straightforward and clear when we communicate. And that's especially true. This is especially true of key information in our speeches, things like the thesis statement and the main point. We don't want to be too wordy, and we don't want to be confusing with that information. We want to be as clear as possible. Here's a bad example here. In the sentence that most exemplifies the main idea, I have the tendency to purposely pontificate and fall into pleonasm. Pleonasm. Oh my God, I messed that up. See, this is why you avoid using words like this. I can't even say that. That word means to use unnecessary words, which has the tendency to make my audience feel like a dog chasing their tail. So don't put yourself in the situation I just put myself in, using a word I don't really say every day. So here's a simpler way of saying this. I write long and complex thesis statements that confuse my audience. Right? It avoids extra words. It avoids very weird, unknown words. And it avoids figurative language like a dog chasing their tail, which isn't very precise. It's easier to say confuse your audience. It's easier to understand confuse your audience. Okay, Next, we're going to talk about concrete and vivid language. This just makes things more interesting. Avoid putting your audience to sleep. Be specific and memorable with your language choices. Appeal to the senses. There was some stuff at the place that people liked. Wow, that is really boring, and what a waste of time. Here's a better way of expressing this. The tech enthusiasts at this year's massive consumer electronics show really enjoyed the foldable LED screens, which are paper thin and easily bendable while offering a crystal clear picture. Okay, so I got specific about who's involved, the place that it's occurring, and the objects or the stuff that's there, and I offered some vivid, sensual description that will be evocative and memorable to the audience. We want to avoid jargon in speech number 2, and really all of our speeches, unless of course we're trying to teach our audience an important term, in which case we want to define that term, spend some time explaining it. Here's an example of jargon in the military. To service the target, the combat theater was entered and a package of ordnance was delivered. Subsequently, a battlefield damage assessment was undertaken in order to assess the softening of enemy assets. It was observed that the ordnance was off target, thereby leading to some collateral damage. Okay, so that has the problem of not being concise as well, but it's really hard to understand. Now, we use jargon because we're experts, because we're involved in talking to other people who are experts, because the language is more precise or nuanced, perhaps, than everyday talk, and also sometimes because it takes some of the emotion and humanness out of it and makes it more work-like, more machine-like, and less interpersonal. Here's an easier way of saying all of that. We attempted to bomb the enemy, but realized we missed and hit the wrong building. Of course, it might not be a building, it could be something else. If we did want to use some of the language in the bad example, maybe we wanted to teach the audience what the military meant by collateral damage, we might say something like, when the general says collateral damage, he's referring to injury, death, or harm to property that was accidental or not intended by the attack. In addition to avoiding jargon, we want to be clear in our speeches when we ever encounter abstractions such as numbers, statistics, or complex ideas. Here's some examples. Nearly 180,000 people were affected. Okay, that might be a hard number for people to visualize, so I follow that up with that's enough people to fill the new Raiders stadium in Las Vegas 4 times. That helps us kind of visualize that, get a sense. If you've seen the new Raiders stadium, of course, as you're driving up the 15, you'll have a frame of reference for understanding 180,000 people. The new Raiders Stadium cost $1.8 billion. For comparison, New York's MetLife Stadium cost $1.6 billion. If the city of Las Vegas used its entire annual budget, it would take them almost 4 years to pay for it by themselves. So offering multiple comparisons there to help my audience understand how much money we're talking about here. A lot. In an opinion poll, this is explaining statistics. In an opinion poll of 1,000 American adults conducted by CBS News, in the days following 9/11, President Bush was viewed favorably by just over 80% of respondents, a remarkable figure when you consider he was polling at around 50% just before the attack. So I explain here a little bit about what the poll is, where it came from, how it was conducted, as well as I give you a comparison of figures so you have an idea, how much 80% actually is. Is that good or bad? I don't know. I don't have a baseline to compare it to. Continuing on, we could make comparisons or give examples about abstract ideas or complex thoughts. So here's some examples. For comparison, drinking a single serving 15-ounce bottle of apple juice is the equivalent of eating 10 Oreo cookies when it comes to sugar. So that gives us a sense of how much sugar is being consumed. The harpsichord has keys like a piano, but its strings are plucked rather than hit with a hammer. So most people are familiar with a piano. They might not know a harpsichord. This gives you a sense of what a harpsichord is by using a piano as a frame of reference. Like Christians and Jews, Muslims believe in an Abrahamic God. If you're familiar with the Christian religions and the Jewish religions, you also might be familiar with some aspects of the Muslim religion. Okay. The space shuttle disaster is a clear example of groupthink. Of course, this would come in a larger speech. I've already defined groupthink. I've just given a rundown of what the space shuttle disaster is, maybe, and so I'm using it as an example to help understand what groupthink is. Planned redundancy is kind of the framing of your speech or the repetition of important ideas. Of course, you want to keep it fresh as you're going. You don't want to repeat the exact language copy-pasted. In other words is a really great phrase for you guys to use and think about. You want to explain a quote. If you use a quote, here's a quote. In other words, you give a definition. In other words, so offer multiple explanations of complex ideas in different words. Internal previewing and reviewing is really important. You know what a preview is in the introduction. You know what a summary is in the conclusion. You can do that as well throughout the entire speech. So you can preview main point number 1 and review main point number 1. You can use your transitions to do that. While the first few years of his life were challenging, his adolescence saw 2 key events that greatly improved his condition: his adoption into a loving family and his attendance at a private school. So this would be like moving from main point number 1, where I was talking about this person's first few years of life, to main point number 2, where I'm going to talk about his adolescence later in his childhood. So that's planned redundancy. And finally, the last thing I want you to consider when making your language choices for the informative speech is to personalize your information. Your information can be sometimes too detached or too mechanical for someone to understand, and personalizing it, helping them put it into a context of the human life, can be helpful. I experienced process anxiety, feelings of dread, and an inability to start when it came time for me to apply for jobs. Okay, so this helps me define what process anxiety is and compare it to a life experience that I had. Here's another example. That weird feeling in your stomach and the pressure you feel on your face when you are on a roller coaster is called G-force. And test pilot John Stapp could withstand up to 46 Gs. That's over 7 times the amount produced by the world's most intense roller coasters. Okay, there's a lot in here. I do a comparison for one thing because I'm using abstract numbers there. But I also ask you to remember what it was like to feel G-forces when you were on a roller coaster. So I'm personalizing the concept of a G-force by having you remember the feeling of it. Okay, so all of these are good ways to improve your informative style. Be concise, plain, and direct. Be vivid and concrete. Avoid abstractions unless you need them, and then clarify them when you do. Avoid jargon unless you need it, and then clarify it when you do. Give us examples and comparisons to have anchor points for us. Use planned repetition to guide us through the speech, and make the things personal and human as you're teaching them, as you're teaching us about them. Good luck with your informative style. Bye-bye.